Xirtus broadcasting service.
Среди своих товарищей торжественно обещаю горячо любить свою родину, жить, учиться и бороться, как завещал великий Ленин, как учит коммунистическая партия, всегда выполнять законы пионеров Советского Союза.
What if marriage was abolished? What if parents disappeared, and every child belonged to the state? In the early years after the Russian Revolution, some Bolsheviks dreamed of exactly that. A universal foundling system. Millions of children raised not by families, but by the collective. This was the radical dream of Alexandra Kollontai, Anatoly Lunacharsky, and the revolutionaries who wanted to abolish love, marriage, and family itself. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels introduced the concept of state child rearing to replace families. In the Communist Manifesto, Engels writes, "Abolition of the family, even the most radical flare-up at this infamous proposal of the communists. But the bourgeois family will vanish as a matter of course when its complement vanishes, and both will vanish with the vanishing of capital." Engels, The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, 1884, argued that the family was tied to women's oppression and private property. Engels' text, The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State was hugely influential for Bolsheviks, especially Kollontai, who saw state rearing of children as a way to socialize reproduction. To us today, the idea of abolishing the family sounds radical, but this was a radical time. To many early Bolsheviks, it seemed not only logical, but inevitable. They had reasons, historical, practical, ideological, to believe the collective could raise children better than any private household. First, there was historical optimism. Marxist thinkers believed the bourgeois family was not eternal, but temporary, a structure tied to private property, inheritance, and patriarchy. As communism advanced, they thought the family would dissolve naturally, replaced by new forms of social life. The revolution was a chance to accelerate that future. These were not empty theories. Examples existed. They pointed to orphanages and foundling homes. By the late 19th century, Russia already had a vast network of church-run and state welfare orphanages, caring for thousands of children without parents. Educators like Anatoly Lunacharsky and Pavel Blonsky saw these as proof that collective care was not only possible, but already happening. There was women's liberation. Alexandra Kollontai argued that the private household enslaved women in endless cycles of cooking, cleaning, and child rearing. To abolish the family was to abolish women's unpaid labor. In communal nurseries, kitchens, and laundries, women could finally step into full equality as workers and citizens. Universal state rearing promised child equality. In traditional society, illegitimate children were stigmatized. Poor children suffered, and family name determined destiny. But in a collective system, every child would be raised alike. No more hierarchy of bloodlines, no more curse of poverty at birth. The child would belong to the nation, not a surname. Soviet psychology and pedagogy promised results. Thinkers like Blonsky and later Makarenko believed children could be shaped into the new Soviet man more effectively in schools and colonies than in private homes. Families passed down superstition, religion, and old prejudices, but in collective care, children could be molded by science and socialism. At the time, radical ideas seemed like solutions to historic problems, and there was utopian spirit. The revolution felt like a total break with the past. So why not remake the most ancient institution of all? If private property could be abolished, if old religion could be abolished, why not abolish the family? To the early Bolsheviks, this wasn't destruction, it was creation, the birth of a new kind of love, the collective parenthood of the future. To understand why, we need to go back to Russia before 1917. This was a society of poverty, famine, and inequality. Infant mortality rates were among the highest in Europe. Hundreds of thousands of children grew up in church-run orphanages and foundling homes. For many radicals, the traditional family was already failing. When the Bolsheviks seized power in October 1917, they promised not just a new government, but a new way of life. If capitalism could be overthrown, why not family, marriage, and private love as well? There are days which are equal to centuries in the history of humanity, and which proclaim that However cruelly the people may have been oppressed by violence and arbitrary rule, the hour will come when a mighty, triumphant, indestructible force, the spirit of the fraternal unity of workers in close alliance with revolutionary will of the deprived masses, will overthrow the old, worn-out order through a powerful upsurge of popular wrath, through the onslaught of democracy stired into heroic rebellion. Pavel Blonsky, Soviet psychologist, pedagogue, and early Soviet educational theorist, believed the family was unfit for the upbringing of the new person. Following the October Revolution, he was made a professor at Moscow University and was heavily involved with and became the first leader of the Academy of Socialist Education. Blonsky advocated large-scale boarding schools and children's colonies to replace family upbringing. Blonsky thought science plus collectivism could produce healthier, more disciplined, more Soviet children. The question of women's liberation was inseparable from the Russian Revolution. For Bolsheviks looking for a solution to the problems of serfdom, the problem of exploitation not only of the worker but woman was inescapable. For centuries, women had been confined to the home, trapped in a cycle of domestic labor, child-rearing, and economic dependence. Marriage was not always a partnership of equals. It was often a contract of survival where women exchanged care, love, and labor for security. By the early 20th century, feminist ideas were spreading across Russia. Activists argued that true equality could only come when women were free from the burdens of the household, free to participate fully in work, politics, and culture. Yet many feminists faced a hard truth. As long as the family remained the center of social life, women would remain bound by private duties, even under socialism. It was in this context that Alexandra Kollontai emerged. She was not only a revolutionary, but a radical feminist who believed that the family itself was an instrument of oppression. For her, women's liberation could not wait. It required a rethinking of marriage, love, and the raising of children. The household was not a sanctuary, it was a cage, and it was the revolution's task to open the door. For Alexandra Kollontai, the family was not simply a private matter. It was an economic system of exploitation. Women, she argued, were doubly oppressed by capitalism in the workplace and by men in the home. Domestic labor, cooking, cleaning, childcare, consumed women's lives, yet was unpaid and invisible. In marriage, women became economically dependent on men, their sexuality controlled, their choices limited. For Kollontai, this was nothing less than a form of bondage. Alexandra Kollontai was one of the most radical thinkers of her time. Born into wealth, she abandoned aristocratic life to fight for revolution. As the world's first female government minister, she argued that marriage was nothing but a bourgeois trap, chaining women to the kitchen and children to private inheritance. She dreamed of a new world where love was free and children were raised by the collective. She wrote that true liberation could only come if housework and child-rearing were socialized, moved out of the private household and into communal kitchens, laundries, and nurseries. Only then would women be free to participate fully in the workforce, in politics, and in love. In her words, the family with its narrow and petty interests withers away when the society takes upon itself all the duties once carried by the household. The labor republic must, therefore, provide the pregnant woman with the most favorable possible conditions, and the woman, for her part, must observe all the rules of hygiene during her pregnancy, remembering that in these months she no longer belongs to herself. She is serving the collective, producing from her own flesh and blood a new unit of labor, a new member of the labor republic. There have been instances where a mother, even a communist mother, refuses to breastfeed a baby that is suffering from a lack of milk, only because it's not her baby. Future society, with its communist emotion and understanding, will be as amazed at such egotistic and anti-social acts as we are when we read of the woman in prehistoric society who loved her own child but found the appetite to eat the child of another tribe. Soviet power tries to create a situation where a woman alone does not have to fear for her life and the life of her child. But Kollontai went further. She believed that sexuality itself had been distorted by the economic dependence of women. Marriage, she argued, was nothing but a legalized form of prostitution, where women exchanged love and intimacy for material survival. Only under socialism could love become free, based on equality, free choice, and mutual respect. This radical vision, abolishing the patriarchal family, liberating women from unpaid labor, freeing sexuality from economics, was not just feminism. It was part of the Bolshevik dream of creating a new society, a new morality, even a new kind of human being. Nadezhda Krupskaya was Lenin's partner and deputy commissar of education. A revolutionary in her own right, Krupskaya dedicated her life to pedagogy and the practical task of building a new system for raising children. Before 1917, she had been a teacher and Marxist theorist, deeply concerned with how working-class children could gain access to education. After the revolution, she became one of the leading figures in the Commissariat of Education, working directly under Lunacharsky. Krupskaya saw childcare not as a private responsibility, but as a collective right. She believed that freeing women from endless household labor required the state to provide nurseries, kindergartens, and after-school clubs. In her words, "The road to woman's equality runs through the nursery and the kindergarten." Under her leadership, the Soviet Union rapidly expanded communal childcare. Between 1918 and 1921, despite civil war and famine, thousands of nurseries, kindergartens, and children's clubs were set up across the country. Some were improvised in factories and communal apartments, others in repurposed churches and estates. For many working mothers, this was the first time they could work a full day while knowing their children were cared for. Reports from the time spoke of children learning collectively, singing revolutionary songs, receiving regular meals, and growing up with a sense of comradeship. Krupskaya herself described how even in hardship, these children stood taller than their years because they felt themselves part of the revolution's great work. Krupskaya's efforts laid the groundwork for the Soviet childcare system that would last throughout the 20th century. Though the grand dream of abolishing the family never came fully true, her nurseries and kindergartens proved that collective childcare could work on a massive scale, and for many women it was nothing short of liberation. Under Lenin's new government, Anatoly Lunacharsky became Commissar of Education. He believed parents could not be trusted to raise the next generation of revolutionaries. Instead, children should be raised in state institutions, trained to be true citizens of socialism. If Kollontai attacked the family for exploiting women, Anatoly Lunacharsky attacked it for corrupting children. As the first People's Commissar of Education, he saw the family as a private institution that produced inequality, ignorance, and superstition. In the home, children inherited the prejudices of their parents, religion, patriarchy, even bourgeois habits. This, he believed, was incompatible with the new socialist order. For Lunacharsky, education was the most powerful weapon of the revolution. He wanted to replace private upbringing with public upbringing, where children would be raised collectively, in state schools and orphanages, under the care of trained educators. Parents, he thought, loved their children, but love was not enough. The state, with science and socialist pedagogy, could raise them better. He pointed to the success of orphanages and state welfare institutions as proof. Even before the revolution, foundling homes had taken in abandoned children and given them structure. Lunacharsky believed that if the state could do this for the poorest, it could do it for everyone. Every child would grow up as a ward of society, equal from birth, shaped not by family privilege, but by collective ideals. To him, abolishing the family was not destroying love. It was saving children from the uneven, often cruel, accidents of birth. He wrote that the Soviet child must not be raised in the dark corner of a family apartment, but in the open, in the sunlight of collective life. This was the opposite of inheritance and bloodline. In place of the old order, family name, private wealth, patriarchal authority, Lunacharsky envisioned a generation that belonged to no one but the future, a family of socialism where the state itself was the only parent. The family, in the old sense, is a school of selfishness. It teaches inequality, it transmits religious prejudices, and it perpetuates the privileges of birth. It is an institution that society must transcend. Source: Lunacharsky, Essay on Education, 1918. Parents love their children, but love is not enough. A socialist society must love them more. With science, with equality, with discipline, the state will be a better father, a better mother, because it will give to all what only the few now receive. Source: Lunacharsky, Speech to Commissariat of Education, 1919. Our orphanages, for all their poverty, have proven that children deprived of family can grow, learn, and become comrades among themselves. If this can be done for the abandoned child, why should it not be done for all? The future does not belong to the family, but to the collective. The new humanity will be raised not by fathers and mothers, but by all of society. Anton Semenovich Makarenko was a Ukrainian schoolteacher who suddenly found himself facing a monumental problem. Millions of besprizorniki, homeless children left orphaned by war, famine, and chaos, roamed the Soviet Union. Theft, gangs, and violence spread across the streets. Not a famous revolutionary at first, his work and ideas proved to be quite revolutionary, not only theory, but in practice. Instead of treating these children as criminals or hopeless cases, Makarenko saw them as the raw material for a new kind of upbringing. He organized them into children's colonies, collective homes where they would live, work, and learn together under discipline and solidarity. In his most famous work, the pedagogical poem 1933, he recounts how collective life could replace the family. The family, in its old sense, has had its day. The collective is now the real parent of the child. Here he finds care, love, labor, and discipline. Here he becomes a human being, not in isolation, but through the strength of comradeship. For Makarenko, love did not come from private parents, but from the bonds forged in a disciplined, working collective. He described the colony as a place where children felt a shared responsibility for each other's growth, something even stronger than the nuclear family could provide. This was not just an emergency measure for orphans. Makarenko argued that the colony model could be the universal model. Every Soviet child raised in collective institutions that were simultaneously schools, families, and productive communes. The child would no longer belong to a single household, but to the entire state, or as he phrased it, to all of society. His system deeply influenced Soviet pedagogy. For decades, teachers and commissars looked to Makarenko as proof that the family could be superseded by the collective, with better results, more discipline, more loyalty, more equality. Where Kollontai envisioned the end of marriage and Lunacharsky dreamed of the state as parent, Makarenko built the practical blueprint for the universal collective family. Together, Kollontai, Lunacharsky, and their supporters imagined a universal system of nurseries, schools, and communes. No child would belong to a single family. Instead, all children would be raised by the socialist collective, free from bourgeois influence, superstition, and inequality. Then, reality struck. World War I, the Civil War, and famine left millions of children without parents. These homeless youths, called the besprizorniki, roamed the cities in gangs, begging, stealing, and starving. To the Bolsheviks, this was both a crisis and an opportunity. Perhaps the chaos could be solved by building the very system they dreamed of, a universal state of foundlings. The 1918 Family Code made divorce easy, abolished the church's role in marriage, and declared all children equal, legitimate or not. Communal kitchens and laundries were built. Nurseries and orphanages spread. Some children grew up entirely in communal institutions, never knowing private family life. Kollontai wrote of the withering away of the family. Lunacharsky described the new socialist child, freed from parental backwardness. This was no longer about emergency care for orphans. It was about designing a new kind of human being. But not everyone agreed. Peasants resisted giving up their children. Even many Bolsheviks found the idea unsettling. To ordinary Russians, family ties were not bourgeois relics. They were the only source of survival in hard times. Reports from early Soviet psychologists and educators noted negative consequences of children without families. Children raised in state institutions frequently struggled with attachment, empathy, and emotional stability. Even when fed, clothed, and taught, they exhibited behavioral problems, rebelliousness, and difficulty forming close relationships. The collective could provide food and education, but it could not provide love. The idea of a universal state communal foundry for all children was not always able to defeat the realities of imperfection either. The communal institutions were often underfunded and chaotic. Teachers asked to be state parents to hundreds of children at once were overwhelmed. Many of the besprizorniki turned to crime, black markets, or violence. Instead of the model Soviet child, the state had created a generation of desperate survivors. The Bolsheviks imagined that the state could replace the family entirely. In theory, children could be raised in nurseries, schools, and collective colonies, fed, clothed, and educated by the revolution. In practice, the results were far from ideal. Even in well-funded orphanages, children suffered emotionally. Human beings are wired to bond with parents, especially mothers. The warmth, care, and individual attention of a family cannot be replicated by institutions, no matter how well staffed. Children raised in orphanages often developed feelings of abandonment, anxiety, and social detachment. They lacked the intimate guidance that even the poorest families provide. While Makarenko was at first a supporter of collective upbringing, even he acknowledged the emotional limitations of institutions. In the pedagogical poem, he described children who were restless, lonely, and longing for the familiar warmth of a mother's care. He emphasized discipline and labor, but he recognized that the affection and emotional security provided by parents could not be fully replicated, and that children raised entirely in institutions often faced long-term psychological difficulties. While revolutionary thinkers debated the abolition of the family, the poet Anna Akhmatova offered a quieter yet profound critique. She saw the state's experiments with collective child-rearing not as liberation, but as a potential threat to the emotional and psychological well-being of children. Akhmatova argued that even in the poorest households, the love of a mother and the cohesion of a family nucleus was essential for healthy child development. Food, education, and hygiene alone could not replace warmth, guidance, and emotional security. She warned that children raised solely by the state might grow disciplined, but they would lack the subtle bonds of trust, affection, and identity that only a family could provide. In her essays and private writings, Akhmatova called for a balance. The revolution should support working mothers with communal childcare and education, but it must not erase the family. The mother remained the child's primary anchor, even in the new socialist society. The ideal Soviet child, she believed, thrived not only on ideology and discipline, but on the daily presence of love and care within the home. The state took note of these facts. Children in even the poorest private families often fared better psychologically. A mother's care, a father's attention, and the simple bonds of home provided a foundation for emotional health, resilience, and social development. The state could not replicate these bonds. It could organize, educate, and discipline, but not nurture the heart. Ultimately, the early Bolshevik experiment exposed a profound truth. The family is more than an economic or social institution. It is the primary source of psychological and even emotional development. Even under conditions of poverty, the bonds of love and trust formed in a household provide children with stability and resilience that no collective, no matter how ideologically pure or well-resourced, can fully replace. In Problems of Everyday Life, 1923, Trotsky wrote that the revolution must reconstruct the family. He believed communal kitchens, laundries, nurseries, and schools would free women and socialize children. The new family must become not a small private world, but a cell of the collective organism. Trotsky did not advocate the immediate abolition of the family. Instead, he envisioned a transitional model, a family restructured to serve the collective. Communal kitchens, laundries, nurseries, and schools would lift the burdens of domestic labor from women, freeing them to participate fully in public life, while children would be socialized into socialist values. He imagined a new, freer, more comradely family, one that was no longer a private, isolated unit, but a cell of the collective organism. In Trotsky's vision, the nuclear family would not disappear, but it would be reprogrammed. Love, education, and labor would be shared, guided, and supplemented by the state commune, absorbing the family into the broader socialist project. This compromise allowed the revolution to respect the natural bonds of parent and child, while ensuring that the family served society. The family nucleus remained, but its functions were extended, regulated, and supported by state institutions, the home no longer an isolated unit, but a contributor to the collective welfare. In Trotsky's eyes, this was the key to combining emotional security with socialist education. Trotsky realized the revolution could not simply erase the family without risking social and psychological collapse. Instead, by absorbing the family into the state commune, the revolution sought to reshape it from within, preserving bonds, expanding responsibilities, and aligning the home with the socialist ideal. By the late 1920s, the early Bolshevik dream of abolishing the family was running into harsh realities. Millions of besprizorniki children reared by the state who had been seized from capitalists, orphaned or abandoned, were roaming the streets, and state institutions struggled to provide care and education at scale. Even when well-funded, collective nurseries and colonies could not replace what the family nucleus had apparently provided the ablest bourgeoisie. Children were disciplined and fed, but many suffered psychological trauma, attachment disorders, and social alienation. Stalin and other party leaders noticed. Eventually, as educators, psychologists, and even party activists highlighted the limits of ideology, it became a popular concept that children needed not only food and schooling, but some sort of compassion and love, and beyond guidance, there was apparently some value to stable family bonds. The state could organize labor and education, but it could not replicate the emotional security that a mother and a family nucleus could provide. The party needed a stable, disciplined, and morally grounded population to consolidate the Soviet state. The breakdown of family structures and the social problems arising from street children threatened social cohesion. Human nature, psychological needs, and social stability could not be fully engineered by ideology alone, not so quickly, not yet. By the 1930s, Joseph Stalin brought the experiment to an end. Marriage was restored as a pillar of society. Divorce was restricted. Abortion was banned. Propaganda celebrated strong Soviet families and heroic mothers. The dream of abolishing family was buried, replaced by a return to traditional order, though under a socialist banner. The future of communal state foundlings for all children to replace family was perhaps not dead, but it went to sleep for another time, until someday, when the new Soviet man and woman was made and able, and a purer form of communism could be tried. The Bolsheviks' vision of abolishing family remains one of the most radical social experiments in history. For a brief moment, they believed humanity could outgrow the most ancient bond of all, that bond between parent and child. Was this utopia or nightmare? Liberation from patriarchy or the destruction of love itself? The early Bolsheviks imagined a universal foundling state. History judged otherwise, but the question remains, what happens when the state tries to replace parents?
Анатолий, вступая в ряды Всесоюзной пионерской организации имени Владимира Ильича Ленина, перед лицом своих товарищей торжественно обещаю горячо любить свою родину.
Elsewhere, similar ideas survived. In the Kibbutzim of Israel, children were raised in communal houses for decades, a small-scale experiment rather than a state mandate. The radical Bolshevik experiments with collective child-rearing did not remain confined to the Soviet Union. In the 1920s and 1930s, Zionist pioneers in Palestine, particularly those influenced by socialist and labor ideals, experimented with a similar vision, the kibbutz. These communal settlements sought to create egalitarian collective societies in which private wealth, private labor, and even the nuclear family were partially subordinated to the needs of the community. The kibbutz movement did not emerge in a vacuum. Several of its founders were former Russian Bolsheviks and socialist revolutionaries who left the Soviet Union after the Revolution and Civil War, bringing with them radical ideas about collectivism, education, and the abolition of private property, including the private family. Figures like Aaron David Gordon, Joseph Baretz, and other early Zionist socialist leaders saw the communal kibbutz as a laboratory for the socialist family. Mothers could work and contribute to society, while children were nurtured collectively, echoing Kollontai's feminist arguments for liberating women from domestic labor. The ideological certainty was rooted in Bolshevik experience. They had seen the Soviet state attempt to reorganize family life on a massive scale, and they believed the experiment could succeed if transplanted into the more controlled and ideologically homogeneous environment of a kibbutz. Among the most influential figures were members of the Hashomer Hatzair and Poly Zion movements, socialist Zionist groups whose leadership included former Russian revolutionaries familiar with Bolshevik theory. They had witnessed firsthand the Soviet experiments with communal nurseries, collective child rearing, and the ideological drive to free children from the constraints of the nuclear family. These pioneers were strongly convinced of the power of communal upbringing. Influenced by thinkers like Kollontai, Lunacharsky, Trotsky, and Makarenko, they believed that private families transmitted inequality, prejudice, and outdated hierarchies. Only by raising children collectively, in nurseries, educational houses, and communal living spaces, could they create a new generation committed to equality, socialist values, and collective responsibility. The early kibbutzim were a conscious adaptation of Bolshevik anti-family theory, a society where the collective replaced the nuclear family, education and socialization were communal, and equality was instilled from birth. For these pioneers, it was not merely idealistic, it was revolutionary. They believed that the family could be reshaped or even partially replaced in the service of a new, socially conscious generation. Inspired in part by Bolshevik thought, early kibbutz leaders adopted collective nurseries and children's houses, where children slept, ate, and played together under supervision, rather than primarily with their parents. The goal was strikingly similar to the Soviet ideal: to socialize children fully into communal values, reduce parental domination, and foster equality from a young age. Kibbutz thinkers believed that the collective upbringing could free women from the burdens of constant childcare. Echoing Alexandra Kollontai's feminist reasoning, mothers could work, contribute to society, and still participate in their children's lives, but under a communal framework. The experiment reflected a compromise, a recognition that children needed love and guidance, but that communal structures could provide education, discipline, and socialization on a large scale. Over time, the kibbutz system evolved. While the most radical ideas, complete separation of children from parents, were rarely sustained long-term, the influence of Soviet anti-family theory was clear. Communal child rearing was seen as a tool to forge the next generation of citizens committed to collective responsibility, equality, and social ideals. This is XBS, Xirtus Broadcasting Service. Xirtus Public Broadcasting is made possible by mysterious shadow councils and ancient secret societies, rogue time travelers and the deep state, and from contributions from Tartarians and viewers like you.